Our guest today is the chief theater critic for the Chicago Tribune. He has reviewed and commented on culture, the arts, politics, and entertainment for 15 years. Our guest today is the Tribune's chief voice on local and national theatrical productions. He also writes a weekly column on culture and the arts. Our guest today is a native of Manchester, England. He earned a doctorate from Ohio State in 1989. Our guest today lives in Evanston with his wife, Gillian Darlow. Gillian, where are you? There we go. Gillian, give her a round of applause. Chris, you obviously married up. And their beautiful young sons, Peter and Evan, who I know will want to watch this on tomorrow when they click on the City Club website. Okay, Peter and Evan. Ladies and gentlemen, Chris Jones. Chris.
Hello, everybody. This is really nice for me to be invited here. I'm very, very honored. I just, my one personal note is I'm on the way in. There's lots of people here who I have not seen in a long time. And Dan Aranda, who gave me my very first mortgage when he worked at Cole Taylor Bank about 25 years ago, literally, when I was a big risk. And without Dan, I would not be standing here. So I don't know where are you, Dan? Thanks a lot. Since this club and its members are so sort of crucial to the growth and the identity of Chicago as a city, I thought I'd try a little experiment. Can you really understand the soul of a city by exploring the record of what its citizens went to see away from their workplace by choice during their time off from the very beginnings of Chicago until the present day, as recorded, usually within 24 hours or so, by people who were sitting next to them in the very same seats? Can you understand the changes in and the maturation of Chicago by sort of reliving or rereading what these critics saw? Do these old reviews and articles from the city's leading newspaper, which has ebbed and flowed and thrived and struggled right alongside the city that it covers, the city that it bleeds, really, tell you more about the past, present, and future of where we might go as a city? A review is a first draft of history, a report of what happened that particular night. An arts event, like, say, a concert at the Chicago Symphony, is by definition absent. A movie you can still see, but a performance at the Lyric Opera in 1965, well, you had to be there, or you have to read the immediate thoughts of somebody who was. So I've written sort of what's really a history of performing arts criticism at the Tribune, the paper where I work, and that I love very much, come hell or high water. It starts in 1850, and it ends in 2012, pretty much, not coincidentally, the entire history of Chicago as a great American city. Most of the critics I write about are dead, and the death of a critic is always interesting and sought after by some. One Chicago Tribune critic, Charles Collins, actually died in his dentist chair on State Street, suffering from a heart attack while he was waiting for the drill. It's a really true story. Another, Percy Hammond, in an sort of apocryphal story, died after the Haitian drummers in Orson Welles' Macbeth put a curse on him after he wrote a lousy review. He died the next day. My favorite story, though, is a more recent one, some people in this room will know, of a writer called Bill Leonard, who is a great arts writer at the Tribune, who had a heart attack at his desk in Tribune Tower while writing a review. And he was carried out of the newsroom by the emergency crew, but he raised his breath to say, quite famously, "The lead is in the second paragraph." And a lot of the people in the newsroom heard him, and the editors stopped the presses, made the changes to the review, and in the next day's Tribune, there was Leonard's notice, just as this great writer had wished it, right alongside his own obituary. It's a great way to go, isn't it? But let's go back, if you will, with me to 1853, which was the first review that I could find in the Tribune. If you define a review, which seems reasonable, as indicating that the writer of it actually went to the show. Always a basic minimum for me, although Claudia Cassidy was known to leave at intermission. That was published 6 years after the paper's 1847 beginning. Now, that year, the population of Chicago was 16,000 people. The Tribune, as it was then known, the Chicago Daily Tribune, was actually the third newspaper to arrive here, following the Chicago American, which was first published in 1835. By 1860, this city had 11 daily papers. But the first review in the Tribune was of a show at John B. Rice's Theater, located near the corner of Randolph and Dearborn Streets, not far from here. The theater business was very good to Mr. Rice. He would go on to become mayor of Chicago. The potential readers of that Tribune review, published in its offices at 51 North Clark Street, likely numbered only around 1,000, which was about the number of copies that the Tribune was printing. The legendary editor Joseph Medill, who would revolutionize the newspaper, had yet to arrive in Chicago. That review was unsigned and prosaic, but this is what interested me about it. The notice appeared in the paper below two more prominent reports. One was that Messrs. Clybourne and Ellis were planning on slaughtering 2 hogs, each more than 1,000 pounds in weight, more pounds than the Tribune was then printing copies. The other was that the biggest load of lumber ever to leave the city of Chicago had just left for LaSalle, Illinois. And so there you had Chicago's priorities right there laid out on the page. Hog butcher to the world and windy self-promoter. The arts came in third. And critics and the artists they covered have railed against that perceived set of priorities ever since. Now even the bears are a problem too. But there was another revealing remark in that 1853 review. It was in the second to last sentence. It said, "The decoration and interior arrangement of the theater are as perfect as almost any in New York." Now, in the following years, 150 of them, Tribune critics would make comparisons with the art scene in New York almost on a daily basis. Many of those allusions would be defiant assertions of superiority or demands for respect. I've written plenty of them myself, but they also contain, perhaps some of them, a shrill note of an inferiority complex, at least in the early days. It took a while for those who wrote about the arts in Chicago to see that the Second City syndrome actually is what made the arts in this city so great, because it kept its ego perennially in check. But by 1968, the Tribune had already published an amazing review under the rather bizarre byline, Peregrine Pickle. Peregrine Pickle, that was the name of the critic. And it was an ode to an actor called Joseph Jefferson, who's actually famous now because of the Joseph Jefferson Theater Awards, but he was really the very first true Chicago actor, famous for playing the title role in Rip Van Winkle. And this is one line in that review that Mr. Pickle wrote in 1868. "When we come to Mr. Jefferson's Rip, comparison cease." This is the guy that fell asleep for all those years. "It stands by itself as sharply defined as the Venus de Medici in statuary. The school of acting which Mr. Jefferson has adopted is the very highest form of dramatic art. He realizes the truth of the old adage that it is the province of art to conceal art." And then Mr. Pickle took to italics. "He completely identifies himself with his character." Now, I'm sitting there reading this in the Tribune archives, and I thought, wow, that was 1868. That was before Emile Zola, before Ibsen, before all the realists and naturalists. Chicago was a crude frontier town in the so-called Northwest. And here was a Tribune critic focusing on the first real Chicago actor and looking for truth, honesty, guts, and reality. I've always thought that the TV commercials to attract tourists to Chicago should sort of start off in Las Vegas and then pull back to reveal that it's all just a facade on the Strip, or show Disney World and say this is not the real America, or take us to a Hollywood backlot and then show what stands behind it. And maybe even borrow a tagline from Nelson Algren, "Never a city so real." This has always been what Chicago has valued in its culture, along with a disdain for artifice and pretension. In 1868, it was already here. By that point, there were more than 250,000 people living in Chicago. The American Civil War had come to an end, and Chicago's lakefront and parks were beginning to attract visitors from throughout the Midwest, tempting them with nights at the theater, along with other urban amusements, shall we say. Sensing this trend, both the Tribune and its competitors began to suddenly start writing about the arts and the other leisure activities to be had in its thriving metropolis. This was the beginning of Chicago as a tourist destination and the beginning of the arts as one of the city's key economic generators. By the way, that peregrine pickle was actually a man called George Putnam Upton, a prolific author and a former Tribune war correspondent who seemed to have an incredible prescient sense for understanding that, looking out at a review and understanding that here was a young American city searching for its identity, but already knowing what it wanted to aim for. Pickle, all his career was not greatly auspicious. In the 1870s, he made the mistake of writing about a burlesque troupe from England called the Blondes. The blondes were literally blondes, and Pickle's coverage of them tended to blur the line between the troupe called the Blondes and blondes in general, causing a massive reaction in the Tribune that year. This was the year before the Great Chicago Fire, after which these disputes tended to stop in this town. But that year, everybody was ready to argue about, do blondes have any dramatic ability? The Tribune ran, I kid you not, a series of articles day after day on that pressing question. The British blondes were doing a show called The Black Crook, which was a so-called leg show, which needs a little more explanation. Upton wasn't the only Chicago critic to take offense. William Story, who was then the editor of the Chicago Times, known for courting notoriety, he wrote a piece criticizing the morality of these blondes, as he put it. That was a bad idea. The women caught Story in the streets of Chicago on February the 24th at the corner of Wabash Avenue and Peck Court, and they horsewhipped him at gunpoint. Reportedly, the leader of the blondes had concealed the horsewhip in her skirts. They stood trial, these Black Crook blondes, an event that the Tribune greeted with column after column of salacious detail. They all had to pay a small fine for horsewhipping the critic, but they had no problem whatsoever selling tickets thereafter. That night, the Tribune reported more than 3,000 curious Chicagoans, most of them men, packed into the Cosby Opera House to judge for themselves whether blondes had any dramatic ability. By 1890, the Chicago was a very different place. The population was above 1 million. The Tribune was now printing 80,000 copies, and it was 32 pages, a lot at the time. Chicago had something of a cultural revolution going on with the great architects, Dagmar Adler, Louis Sullivan, Daniel Burnham, hard at work. For the first time, Chicago could really claim an indigenous artistic culture from the other side of the Atlantic, although the city was also frequently attacked by literary figures, from Oscar Wilde to Robert Louis Stevenson, all of whom would show up here and report on its ugliness and brutality. Although Oscar Wilde was one of the first people, I think, to make this connection between what Chicago was as an industrial center and its cultural soul. He said, "I've always wished to believe that the line of strength and the line of beauty are one." He wrote about Chicago in 1888 after he'd been here. But it wasn't until I saw the waterworks at Chicago that I realized the wonders of machinery, the rise and fall of the steel rods, the symmetrical motions of the great wheels is the most beautifully rhythmic thing I've ever seen. The newly massive labor force in Chicago, though, was causing a lot of unrest. The International Working People's Association, headquartered here, actually published 7 of its own newspapers. There's a thought, an organization with 7 different newspapers in 1880. The anarchists were a major force in the city. The Tribune covered the so-called Haymarket riots and the hanging of the alleged perpetrators at exhaustive length, and it admired their punishment dropped to eternity, declared the headline on the day of the execution in 1887. So there was a lot of interest in the first local production of Henrik Ibsen's radically feminist play, A Doll's House. Now, the Tribune had generally been no friend of those anarchists, but this review was strikingly welcoming to such a controversial play, differentiating Chicago from the insularity of the English and the self-absorption of the French. Chicago was gaining confidence. A case was made in the review for us to see more work by Bjørnstjerne Martinus Bjørnson, which was a fascinating reminder of the massive influence of Scandinavian culture in the Chicago of the 1890s. We forget that, I think. In later years, the Tribune would become more conservative, as many of you know, especially under its famous publisher, Colonel Robert McCormick. But at that moment, it wrote this: "The opposition comes from the fearful conservative classes to this play." You would not, sort of expect to see that really in a later Tribune. That review of A Doll's House doesn't tell you much about the production, really, but it does actually mock the main male character in the play, whose name is Torvald, who doesn't understand his wife. It mocks his ways. Is not Torvald most exquisitely masculine, the review writes? Which leads me to think that maybe this anonymous review was actually written by a woman, but it's very difficult to tell. But it also made me think that Chicago's sort of famous macho thing, I'm always irritated every time I go and see Fiddler on the Roof, which is often the one, the Anna Tevkin who comes here is Laser Wolf the Butcher, right? But it was interesting, when A Doll's House was first here, this city was already critiquing its own identity. By the dawn of the 20th century, Chicago had been transformed. After the World's Columbian Exposition of 1893, writers were increasingly attracted to the city. Upton Sinclair, L. Frank Baum, the Art Institute of Chicago was open, the Field Museum was open, but it still had its fervent detractors. It holds more than 1 million people with bodies, said Rudyard Kipling. It stands on the same soil as Calcutta. Having seen it, I urgently desire never to see it again. It is inhabited by savages. And I will say, when I reviewed The Jungle Book, I kept that quote in mind. That year, the Tribune published the first review anywhere of The Wizard of Oz. Its author, a newspaper reporter in Chicago, L. Frank Baum, who wrote children's books in his spare time. The Tribune's review is the first review anywhere of The Wizard of Oz. It was staged at Fred Hamlin's Grand Opera House. The designs were done by an illustrator who actually worked for the Tribune. Before opening night, the paper pumped up the show, saying there'd be more than 100 performers on stage, and indeed there were, and the show lasted until midnight. The characters were very, very different. The Wicked Witch of the West came from the north. Toto was a cow in that version. Nonetheless, the show moved to Broadway, where it thrived, and shortly thereafterwards, a few years, a movie version rather exceeded expectations. A mostly forgotten Tribune writer called Russell McFarlane wrote about Baum in the 1950s in a piece about the 100th anniversary of his birth. He hit on something interesting about The Wizard of Oz, which I think has often been overlooked, that this was very much a piece of writing, very much in the Chicago tradition of Heartland realism. Here, he wrote, was something new. He's writing about The Wizard of Oz. Here was a fairy story for boys and girls, rooted deep in the American soil. I don't think you can talk about Chicago theater without saying something about the famous Iroquois Theater fire. That theater, located on Randolph Street between State and Dearborn, had been a huge leap forward for the arts in Chicago. Its debut production, Mr. Bluebird, had 200 performers. It starred the esteemed vaudevillian Eddie Foy Sr., and the Tribune reviewed it. A few days later, the theater burned down as in a consequence of what the Tribune would later report in a very early example of the paper's long tradition of investigative reporting, with shoddy construction that had disregarded even the most basic safety considerations. Even the asbestos fire curtain jammed on the way down. Clearly, the entertainment venues were hardly immune from Chicago's habit of moving too quickly. 600 people died, many of them children. The paper also published the following morning a riveting account. The following morning, this was late at night too, a riveting account of that fire, which led to all manner of changes in the law. The next day, the Tribune also devoted eight pages in total to this fire, and they actually published the name of everybody who had died the following morning. The entire editorial staff stayed up all night, And this, this is difficult to do in that era, and had the name of every man, woman, and child who died in that fire, which is, I think, of all the achievements of the paper in its history, that's certainly one of the most amazing. And it was kind of incredible, really. Now, having said that, the actual story, as you read it, it focuses a bit too much on the actors, frankly, who were interesting to readers because they were showbiz people, but they all survived. 70% of those 600 deaths that night were of audience members sitting in the gallery. So, but the theater in Chicago is not just buildings. It's always been roiled with political debate and issues like that. In 1912, the Tribune actually published a review written by Theodore Roosevelt, which is sort of interesting. Here's a theater review in Chicago penned by the 26th President of the United States. It was indicative of the huge national clout of Jane Addams, the famous reformer social worker, whose Hull House players had been performing a play called Justice by the English writer John Galsworthy that advocated for better conditions in prison. Somehow, Addams got Roosevelt to leave the dull dinner that he was at, go to her theater, see the play. Somebody tipped off a reporter because somebody was along, and then the reporter sat next to Roosevelt as he watched this play, and then asked him what he thought of it, and he wrote this review that was duly published the next day. More importantly, he went back and read as much of this writing on prison reform as he could, and it's a great example of how a show in Chicago really changed the conditions in America's prisons by reaching the president. In 1924, a woman called Maureen Dallas Watkins showed up at the paper looking for work as a reporter, and she was hired to write about crime from a feminine perspective for $50 a week. She made her mark on page one fast, thanks to a couple of Chicago's nastier brands of killer women. The glamorous flapper Beulah Allen had shot her lover, Harry Kelstedt, and then took a few moments to play hula-loo on the phonograph as the poor fellow expired in a pool of blood. Kelstedt had made the mistake of telling Annan he was leaving her. Annan got a fast-talking lawyer named W.W. O'Brien and gave a lot of press conferences. She got a lot of offers of marriage. 6 days later, she announced she was pregnant, but the trial went ahead, and Annan dressed up to the nines in front of the all-male jury. According to Watkins's page one story, her defense was, "We both grabbed for the same gun." She was found not guilty and walked away. There was never any mention of any baby again. Now, if the plot of that real thing that happened in Chicago sounds familiar, it's because, well, there was another one. Belva Gartner was a stylishly divorced woman who had an inconveniently dead boyfriend named Walter Law, who was a young and married automobile salesman. As Watkins's prose replayed on page one of the paper, Gartner was found with the gun that shot the guy and his blood on her body. In her defense, she drunk too much gin to remember what came down, and she got off as well. So, Watkins quits the Tribune with those stories in her notebook, changes the name slightly. Roxy Hart actually came from an old murder in Indiana, but the crimes that appear nightly on Broadway in Chicago are exactly the same. Now, the general view is that Watkins was a reporter who then went showbiz, as some do. I'm not sure that's really true. The more you read of her writing, you get the suspicion she was a playwright all along who had come to Chicago looking for good material, and boy, did she find it. And I'm not sure she really did the city any favors in the end, but nonetheless, it was sort of fascinating. Another time, sometimes the Tribune really worked in allegiance, I think, with other forces in the city. Take, for example, the fascinating story of Tobacco Road, which premiered here in 1935. It was reviewed by a guy called Charles Collins, a fierce conservative at the paper, who despised the New Deal, as of course did his boss, Colonel McCormick. Collins went to Tobacco Road. He called it the cussingest play, great Tribune adjective, that has ever been staged in this profane era. Now, Edward Kelly, who was then the mayor of Chicago, longtime friend and associate of McCormick's, of course, was, of course, Collins' boss. He was also very anxious to prove his morality and to separate himself from such notoriously corrupt predecessors as Big Bill Thompson, who had presided over Chicago's years as the capital of vice. So, With Collins's review as his evidence, Kelly shows up at the theater, closes it down, tells them it's no longer legal to present Tobacco Road in Chicago, and that we're not going to condone filth. Actually, Collins had liked one of the actors in the play, but Kelly, and what I think was a clever idea for a politician, decided that made the play filthier still because this performance was so good. My suspicion is that the two of them were all of this was pre-planned, but nonetheless, Collins was sort of furious with the whole thing. It's fascinating to see the difference in the reaction here to Tobacco Road in the 30s from the reaction to A Doll's House just a few years later, all about sort of the changing nature of the city and, of course, its newspaper. The group theater and Clifford Odets, the great radical American writer, got no charm here in Chicago. The actual headline of the first review of Waiting for Lefty, a very famous Clifford Odets play, this was the headline: "Play by Odets laden with red propaganda." Things went from there. But like everything else, writers are not that simple. Collins actually was a very, very smart and sympathetic critic. So I was fascinated by a lot of his writing about Thornton Wilder, the great American writer. Now, when you read lists of Chicago writers, you never think of Thornton Wilder. You associate him with other places, and that's sort of true, I think. But beginning in 1930, Wilder started teaching at the University of Chicago, and in a new biography of him, his biographer says of all the cities he was associated with, Chicago was the one that he considered home. He had a fascinating group of friends here, ranging from Fanny Butcher, who at that point was the literary editor at the Tribune, to Jack McGurn, who was Al Capone's chief lieutenant, and the three of them would have dinner together. Wilder himself was also something of a man about town at that era, showing up in the Tribune gossip columns in the 1930s. When he lectured at the University of Chicago's downtown campus on Sophocles, there were billboards up all over the city, which gives you a sense of how Chicagoans in the 30s were still consuming what you would think of as high-end culture in pretty massive numbers. In 1943, there was a performance of Carmen, the opera, at Soldier Field in front of 25,000 people. That was not uncommon in the era. That happened to be the first review by Claudia Cassidy, the most notorious critic in the history of the Chicago Tribune. Her sharp-edged writing was unfailingly to the point. It was witty, unforgiving, beautiful at times, frequently cruel. She was hired by McCormick, one of his best hires personally, in 1942, wooed away from a competitor, and she was incredibly powerful. When she died, the obituary in the Times said something like, "Claudia Cassidy did not mince words in Chicago." Indeed not. She suffered from somewhat of she wanted to stand for high standards, I think, and she wanted the arts to be broadly available, but you can see in a lot of her writing this conflict that many of us feel between, if something is popular, does it make it less good? It's a very Chicago issue. Claudia dared to call Arthur Miller a pygmy, which is one of her more stupid things, but nonetheless, she saved the career of Lorraine Hansberry. Without Claudia, no Lorraine Hansberry, no A Raisin in the Sun. There's no way that would ever have gone to Broadway without Hansberry's support. And her writing on Tennessee Williams is, I think, the best writing I've ever read anywhere on that particular playwright. If you'll indulge me, let's share one tiny, tiny passage. This is about Streetcar Named Desire. And she says, everybody thinks Streetcar's a man's play, and with Brando it was. Streetcar's really a woman's play. It belongs to Blanche, and here in Chicago, Uta Hagen tears you to tatters. I walked out of that performance to see Tennessee in the back row, tears pouring down his face. When they come to take her away, Blanche shrinks from the squat, institutionalized female. The man in charge takes over. He lifts his hat and offers her arm. Blanche takes it like a woman going to dinner. She says, "Whoever you are, I have always depended on the kindness of strangers. It is a lovely, gallant exit, but it is an exit to the madhouse just the same." It's an incredible description of the last scene of Streetcar, I think. She also said, make no small plans. Why shoot at a lamppost when that's why they hang out the moon? In 1959, Claudia wrote an amazing piece called Critic, or How to Talk Yourself Out of a Perfectly Good Job. This is what she wrote. Just the other day, in an outburst of optimism about sloughing off concerts I preferred not to cover, I suggested that my newspaper install an IBM machine at Ravinia into which I could feed the program, the name of the conductor, the temperature, train and plane noises, and several mosquitoes, whereupon it would relay a neat review to the Tribune. Claudia writes that. She gets a reply from IBM. Dear Miss Cassidy, we read with interest your review in last Sunday's Tribune, in which you mentioned the possibility of having an IBM machine relieve the music critic of some of his chores. Actually, modern computer technology has advanced to the point, this is 1959, where this is now feasible. We have large-scale memory devices which are capable of storing the vast amounts of information which would have to be called upon in this problem. Claudia was, I think, intending that story as satire. It was 1959. Who could imagine, right? But in fact, by 2012, at least in some areas, there was actually, in fields like data-rich reporting, stories really were being written by computers. And I remember being at a party once, and I encountered a guy who was in charge of one of these things, and I protested that, a review is only as good as the person feeding it in. And then a few weeks go by, and I find myself reading Wired magazine, and there's this guy, a story about this guy, and he said that the Wired reports him saying, I met a critic at a party, and when I discussed this, he became agitated and manic, which is pretty much exactly what I did. Claudia, though, cried out most for Chicago to develop its own cultural soul, and it did. It wasn't necessarily the one that she wanted. She had a grander vision, and actually the indigenous Chicago art scene that emerged took place in storefronts. It took place in church basements. It was a scrappier thing than Claudia had actually had in mind. But it was very much in the wheelhouse of the second great Tribune critic of the 20th century, who was Richard Christensen. Richard, who is very much alive and well, went to shows in small theaters, which you could not say of Cassidy with any regularity. Rick Hogan wrote in the Tribune shortly after Christensen's retirement, he went to shows in storefronts, attics, lofts, suburbs and city, and even somebody's living room. Christensen is known as a gentlemanly critic who accentuated the constructive and who, unlike Cassidy again, rarely was mean or caustic. He was and is widely beloved by those he covered. Although he's widely credited, and truly, with never being arrogant, he was actually no shrinking violet when he was in his job. Much of the growth in Chicago theater came not just from his reviews, but from the remarkable clout that he enjoyed within the paper's halls, as indeed had Cassidy. Richard's reviews have always been carefully reported. Never a free-form writer, very much a newspaper man of the old school, but he never left before the end of the second act. In some ways, Christensen and Cassidy represented the two poles of arts criticism in this city, although by necessity here, there's many, many other great writers, Hetty Weiss, I could go on and on and on, but there are many critics at other publications too. But those two held their job cumulatively for more than 50 years, and they had a great imprint together from different points of view on the growth in this city. Without Cassidy, no career for Tennessee Williams. I think The Glass Menagerie would have had a different ending, because at that point the producers were pressuring Williams to have Laura get lucky with her gentleman caller, and Cassidy put a stop to that. And without Richard, you could argue that the great Steppenwolf Theater would at least have taken longer to reach public attention, if you like. And certainly there would have been no career quite so quickly for William Peterson, an actor who Richard Christensen greatly loves. In a very passionate review of In the Belly of the Beast, one of Richard's most famous reviews, he wrote of Billy Peterson, he howls in pain and shouts in rage with raw intensity. Those qualities are admirable in acting and can be accounted for, but how do I account for the fact that minutes after leaving the theater Thursday night, I had to pull my car over to the side of the street so that I could clear the tears from my eyes? So there's a really funny, popular story in Chicago theater circles which goes, did Richard come to your show? And the actor one says, did Richard come? Actor two says, yeah, he came. Actor one says, did he like it? Actor two says, yeah, he liked it. Actor one says, yeah, but did he pull over? It's always been the ultimate Always been the ultimate. Well, to finish, that was all 30 years ago, by the way, that review, which I realized that when I was preparing this talk, 30 years ago. So that's frightening in and of itself. But let me end with a show that I saw myself in 2008. I walked into the basement of the Chopin Theater in Wicker Park for a production of Our Town, a Chicago play, remember, because Thornton Wilder was here. And I can say authoritatively that Our Town was written in Chicago. There's no question about that. When you look at the years it was written and where Wilder was, that is a Chicago play. Just not acknowledged very much as one. And perhaps the greatest American play, certainly in most people's lists of the top 3 or 4. Now, if you know that play from high school or some other place in your life, you might remember that the third act takes place in the cemetery at Grover's Corners, and the town's dead citizenry, including Emily, the main character who has died in childbirth, they look over at the living citizens there, and they speak sadly of how little they appreciate life, its beauty, the people that they love. If only they knew how precious life actually was. If only they knew how petty and stupid all their little conflicts were. This is how it feels once you look back from the graveyard. It's all ridiculous. You have life. If only you can know that and live in the moment. Now that show, which made Cromer's career, and is perhaps, if you were to say what's the very best Chicago show, I don't think I would have one. I have about 10 maybe, but this one's certainly up there. It really needs about 20 actors to do it. But after doing his Chicago thing and removing the sentimentality from the show and making it more truthful, Cromer had this clever idea, and this is what he did. You went out for intermission in Act 2, right? So there was the beginning of the graveyard scene. And when you came back into the theater, Cromer had filled the theater with people in the graves who you had not seen before. I'm speaking here of maybe 50, 60, 70 people, Chicagoans of all walks of life, black, white, Latino, young, old, children, middle-aged people, families together, just people who had died, if you like. And it was one of the most astounding moments I think I've ever seen in any theater everywhere, and I've seen a few shows in my life. I'm convinced that Peregrine Pickle, the guy that called the natural school of action, and who said that's what Chicago does in the arts, the natural school of action, who said that in 1859, I'm convinced he would have loved that show. And I think Claudia Cassidy would have liked it too, although I don't think she would have liked the fact that it was down in a basement. So the profession of critic, maligned as it is, be it of art, be it of movies, be it of theater, be it of the symphony, the lyric opera, the gallery, the TV show, it's without question fragile. We've kind of been dropping like flies. But it's been, in this town anyway, the profession's been practiced as long as there has been Our Town. I'm lucky enough to work for a paper that's about to expand its arts coverage and its theater coverage, particularly this fall online. And I'm grateful for that. And there have been hardworking men and women at all of Chicago's newspapers throughout this city's incredible journalistic history who have gone to the theater, gone to a movie, gone to the concert hall, trolled the nightclubs of the city, gone to the opera houses, night in, night out, and they've told Chicago about what they've found there, and in so doing, they've told Chicago about itself. Thank you.
Great speech. Hi. If I could have everyone. Yeah. My name is Tweet Thornton. I'm the executive director here at the City Club of Chicago. More importantly for today, I'm a former student of Chris Jones, and I'm also and that makes me a proud graduate of DePaul's Theater School. I'm not sure this stage was one of the stages that Chris was talking about when he encouraged the students to go out and take a look at the stages of Chicago, but it's an honor to stand on this stage with him today. So the first question, I was going to start off with my own. The Great Chicago Fire Festival that the city of Chicago is working with Red Moon Theater. I was wondering what your thoughts were, and how does Chicago compare when it comes to outdoor performances with some of the other cities in the country?
Thank you. So that, if you don't know what that is, that's a project upcoming that's sort of going to be a massive outdoor spectacle that I think, as I understand it, is really going to wrestle with some of the city's sort of fundamental problems, particularly violence in its streets, and that he's going to sort of artistically respond to that in a performance that's going to take place at different places along the Chicago River. And I think that's going to be, a signature event in the city. It's certainly the event that the city of Chicago has gotten behind, and I know the philanthropic community has gotten behind it too. And I think it's something that we're really interested to see, and an example of how the artists of the city have always wrestled with those more serious problems, I think.
Chris Long, Board Governor, City Club of Chicago. While the history of cultural life in Chicago was fascinating, I was struck by the absence of coverage of the rich life among the many ethnic groups here. The municipal groups, the civic groups, does this absence amputate the richness of Chicago life?
Well, I will say this. One thing that I didn't say in that talk was that when you're looking at the culture of a city over this long period of time, sometimes there's a second story that's not immediately obvious, and that is that which is not written about. And there's no question about that there were things that the Tribune ignored, that other newspapers ignored historically, particularly the time that was most egregious, I think, was in the 1940s, when Chicago already at that point had a very developed African-American theater scene on the South Side in the 40s. It is difficult to find meaningful coverage of that. In fact, I think I can say, as I worked long and hard looking for this, that there was no review ever done of that theater. And it wasn't really until, I'd say, 30 years later that some attempts were made to redress that. So I think that is absolutely right, that there is, we're in the business of selectivity, I suppose, on some levels, but still, sometimes the deeper story is that which is not written about becomes kind of a narrative all of its own.
This question is not signed, which we do discourage, but we'll ask it anyway. Some say your reviews skew too positive. Do you agree? Why are 1-star or 0-star reviews so rare?
Well, that's nice. It's interesting. I don't hear that a lot. I hear the opposite more. I do try and I'm committed to respecting the trust of readers. I mean, the great technological change in criticism has really been this, when you really boil it down, that there are now multiple places to get coverage of almost anything. And I'm not just speaking about the arts, anything. You can get opinions on everybody has an opinion. They always did, but now you can publish them more easily. So for the likes of me, the only chance we have of survival is to be trusted. Claudia Cassidy famously said, when anybody would ask her, do you have too much power, which she got a lot, she would always say, I only have power so much as readers invest trust in me. It's true of the whole newspaper. The newspaper only has power based on the trust of those that read it. And I truly think that, so I am invested in the trust of that. I often say, when people ask me about that I find that firstly, people's time is valuable, their money. A lot of what I cover is quite expensive now to go and see. I watched a guy in New York plunk down $900 for 4 tickets to Death of a Salesman, and I had this moment of thinking to myself, is that worth that? $900? He was buying premium seats on Broadway, And I was like, oh my God, is that really $900? So there are moments like that which embolden you to write the reviews that say, this is a total waste of time. 0 stars would have to have no merit. That would have to be egregiously awful, which I don't, frequently encounter in Chicago, thank God. But I do respect the fact, the other thing I respect is that people don't go to the theater alone. They go with somebody. And if you come to hear me speak, you're probably the person taking the other person. And often I find that those people don't mind for themselves. They just feel humiliated with their husband or their date. And I really mean that. And I think that I'd really try to protect those people. The worst letters to get are the ones that say, I went to the show that you recommended and I had a terrible time. And I get them quite often. And I get the reverse. Why did you despise this when it's so great? And once you've sifted out whether or not those are real questions, which they often are, I try to apologize and say, I'll try to do better next time in reflecting so you know what you're getting.
Christy Hefner, longtime City Club member. What do you think is the right balance in criticism among sharing your own opinion, educating the reader by putting the work in some historical academic context, and explaining what the play is?
Well, it's a hard question. The reality, I think, is that a review has to follow multiple functions. That is to say, I have to let people know if the show is any good. I want the people in the theater who know most about it to respect what I say, and they are very difficult to get to respect you, frankly, in part because they know the process of the show, if you like, which you don't see as a critic. You come in, they know all that went on in this long process, and they expect you to sort of intuit that, in order to give a verdict that they recognize as true. So that I work very hard at trying to do that. It's very, very difficult. Experience helps in that. But the other thing that I really think that we do is we offer coverage for people who are too busy to get to every show. I bet there's people sitting in this room who would never go to a show, even however much I go on about it. 12 stars, you're not going to go. Right. But you want to know who's up, who's down, what's going on at Steppenwolf, because you want to come to a dinner like this, and who has time to read everything, right? You want to look like an informed citizen. You want to be an informed citizen. And you don't want to have to go to everything. And I find that a very legitimate use. That's really what my book was about. It's a record of what happened. And it's not just about, is it any good? It's about what took place. Because this is the record of that, of an event that is now gone. And that it's no good writing years and years later about it. You had to write it that night. Only then can you know what it felt like to be in that church basement in Highland Park in the early years of Steppenwolf. It's the only way. Because history and time, it just takes it away from us.
Somewhat along that same line, another unclaimed question, but I think it dovetails well. Do you feel that too few people and publications cover the arts in Chicago? And if so, what can be done?
Too few people?
Too few, yes.
Well, I think it is always a battle to, cover as much as you can. There is part of me, if you forgive the cynical side, there is a part of me that I've known from experience that it's never enough, that sometimes, we are literally going to greatly expand what we're doing online this fall, and it's not like everyone is going to suddenly go, wow, that's great, you're covering everything that needs to be covered. It's an infinite amount, and we really do our best to try and get to just as much as we can in all of the artistic fields that the paper covers. It's very, very difficult. And frankly, the hard truth is not everything on a stage is worth anybody's time beyond the people doing it. Not everything in the concert hall. That is just a reality that we have to, try and find out, try and sift, if you like, the wheat from the chaff a little bit. But we do, it is true that arts coverage has been shrinking. This is the hardest part, if I may. The hardest part in the New World Order is in the new media landscape, we have gotten very, very specialized. So there are websites for all particular interests, right? The struggle that the arts have, I think, in that landscape is what a newspaper offers uniquely is that kind of smorgasbord where somebody looking for a story on the Bears will encounter a Steppenwolf review by accident. And that is, I think, what I hear most that people are anxious to preserve. And I think as we all adapt to the new online world, that has to be something that the leaders of the media really have to pay attention to. How do you maintain, in a highly specialized world, that ability to accidentally broaden your mind? The sort of thing that the Tribune and other newspapers have done for years, how can we now do that and at the same time, economically adapt to this new landscape? But, we're trying.
Right. Chris Jones, just as fascinating now as he was a couple of years ago. 12. I'll take that. I'll take that. Chris, thanks so much. How about another round of applause? Chris.